So we are going to start today on the elements of a short story, the first lesson for the short story unit. So first we're going to talk about what a short story is. So short story is a piece of fiction that can typically be read in one sitting. It focuses on a self-contained incident or a series of linked incidences with the intent of evoking a single effect or mood, okay? The dictionary definition is an invented prose narrative shorter than a novel, usually dealing with a few characters and aiming at unity of effect and often concentrating on the creation of mood rather than the plot. So it's all about how you feel in a short story, not so much what the plot is. Obviously the plot's very important, but it evokes some sort of emotion out of you when you read a short story. The short story is a crafted form in its own right. They make use of a plot and other dynamic components, and it mixes in a lot of literary elements and techniques. So there are different types of themes that you would find within a short story, different kinds of conflicts that you'll find within a story. So conflict, you'll notice that all short stories have the same general idea of conflicts that are going to be happening, and then those things have to be solved. So you have man versus self. So man versus self is the only true version of internal conflict you will find in literature. In this mode, the conflict takes place within the mind of the main character and often involves the character making a decision between right and wrong or mixed emotions. However, the struggle could also exist in the form of a character battling mental illness. So it's just a character versus themselves, okay? Then you have man versus man. This is the most typical type of conflict that you'll find. One person against another person, right? So you have external conflict, and it's also known as interpersonal conflict. This mode lies at the heart of all dramatic arts and places the struggle directly between the protagonist and the antagonist. The protagonist is the person that's good that you're rooting for. The antagonist is the bad guy, okay? So the bad guy is keeping the good guy from getting something, and you want the good guy to win. Man versus society. So this mode of external conflict occurs when the protagonist is placed at odds with government or cultural tradition. This type of conflict applies to societal norms as well. For example, if a child gets in trouble with his parents for sneaking out of the house at night, he's in conflict with societal tradition that you're supposed to obey your parents and be home by a certain time, okay? Then you have man versus nature. Man versus nature pits the main character against forces of nature in the form of natural disaster or a similarly dangerous situation, and is often associated with literary naturalism, which hinges on the idea of nature being indifferent to humanity. So, for example, I don't know if you guys have ever seen the movie Castaway, but that's kind of what happens. The man is, like, there's a plane that goes down, the man is stuck on an island, he has to learn how to live on that island. This ball becomes his only friend, he's fighting nature to survive. That's man versus nature, okay? Man versus machine. Man versus machine can mean that a person is in direct combat with robots in the context of science fiction, or it can mean that technology is standing in their way. So it's one or the other, right? So it's either like you're fighting robots, or the effects and stresses of technology are weighing you down. Either way, it's some sort of like science fiction where man cannot succeed or is trying to succeed against a force that seems like man-made, like a machine. However, if a person struggles to keep a job at the new machine can do better, like for example a grocery store when those take over actual cashiers, things like that. It's an emotional struggle against a society that's breeding technology. Man versus fate or supernatural. So man versus fate exists in any story where the protagonist is struggling against a god or gods. It is sometimes considered a part of man versus self when focused on an internal moral struggle, and should be considered separate in the context of epics such as like Odyssey, where the gods are present antagonists. So basically what it's saying is like it's just you versus like external forces that you can't really control. So gods, fate, serendipitous things, so it's just kind of like things that are out of your control. So external conflict is a struggle that takes place between the main character and some outside force. Therefore, it is outside the body of the protagonist. Okay? This means it's happening outwards. Usually it occurs when the protagonist struggles against the antagonist, a character that opposes the protagonist in the main body of the story. Other types of external conflict could arise due to some other factors such as forces of nature and society in which the protagonist lives. So you have external conflict being character versus character, so two people against each other. Character versus society, when the main character is standing up for their beliefs and it's against the way the society wants things to be. Character versus nature, when you're struggling against the forces of nature and forces of the environment, okay? So for example, in the short story To Build a Fire by Jack London, which you guys will be reading, this tells the story of an anonymous narrator and his dog traveling through the wilderness of the Yukon Trail. So the way that every story needs to be set up if you're going to be writing a short story is just like this. So you have your exposition. This is the beginning of the story when the setting and the main characters are introduced. So you always want to introduce the setting and the main character in the beginning of the story. Then you have an inciting incident. This is the event in the story that causes the conflict. So it's the thing that starts off the conflict, okay? Then you have the rising action. These are the events that lead up to the most intense moment of the story. So the inciting incident is kind of like striking the match, and the rising action is the match burning, and the climax is it on fire. Everything on fire, okay? So you have the climax. This is the moment of the story when the climax is at its highest point, a sudden change in the story. So something has been built up from the inciting incident to the rising action. Now we're at the climax, poof, everything's going crazy. It's switching what happens in the story. Then you have the falling action. These are the events that help resolve the conflict. And then you have the resolution, which is the end of the story, the conclusion. So the beginning or the exposition, the opening of the story usually provides background information on the characters and setting. It introduces the main characters, gives details that help establish the setting, and may also explain what happened before the story began. Then you have the inciting incident. So the inciting incident starts as the action of a story and sets the main questions the readers want to know. So it's, if we look over here, inciting incident is in a plot, is an event or a point that arrives at the beginning of a play, book, or story that disturbs the action. So it kind of ruffles the feathers of the story. So everything's fine, and then you hear a knock at the door. That'd be the inciting incident. The knock at the door could be someone's like ex-husband coming back. Now we're at the rising action, and then the ex-husband kills the whole family. That's the climax. You know what I mean? So the inciting incident would be like, what stirs up underneath to start the huge cycle of everything going wrong, basically. Okay? Then you have the rising action in a plot is a series of relevant incidences that create suspense, interest, and tension in a narrative. Okay, so what this means is that it's the cycle of things that keep going after the inciting incident that actually starts to make you feel like this is actually going to blow up. It's going to be a problem. So in literary works, a rising action includes all the decisions, character flaws, and background circumstances that together create turns and twists leading to the climax. We find it in novels, plays, and short stories. The rising action is one of the elements of plot, which begins immediately after exposition. So the climax, this is the highest peak of excitement, peak point of excitement, turning point of the story, okay? So what happens here is where the tension hits its highest point. It's a structural part of a plot, and is sometimes referred to as a crisis. It is a decisive moment or a turning point in a storyline at which the rising action turns around into a falling action. So it starts, this is such a crazy moment, the only thing we can do is try to fix this moment. Okay, so in a 5-act play, the climax is close to the conclusion of Act 3. So this means that basically in total, if you're looking at this in a grand scheme, the climax is the most important, exciting part. Falling action occurs right after the climax when the main problem of the story resolves. It is one of the elements of the plot of the story, the other elements being exposition, rising action, climax, and resolution. Falling action wraps up the narrative, resolves loose ends, and leads towards closure. So this is what happens right before the ending. So things starting to come together, the aha moment, oh, I get it now, if it's like a suspense thing, or things starting to solve themselves so that the ending of the story can end in a specific way. Then you have your conclusion. So the conclusion will follow the climax, and basically it's the end of the story, tying everything up at the end of the story. So the conclusion, whether it's good or bad, it's the way that the story ends. So like the resolution. So special plot techniques, we'll get into this a little bit more in the next lesson, but foreshadowing is when the author leaves little clues around the story to kind of predict what might happen further on in the story or later on in the story. Flashbacks, a lot of authors use flashbacks so that you can get information about something that happens in the story without having to have a whole 60 pages about it. You can be like, oh, flashback to when he was married. Boom, now we're back. He's not married now, but now you know he was married. It kind of just helps the story move along. Okay, so what you're going to do for your homework is that you're going to read Dark Brown Dog. It's a book that's here. And there's also a book called, short stories, so they're not books, Dark Brown Dog. And you're going to determine who you think the main character is, the inciting incident, the rising action, the climbing, let's do that again. So you're going to read Dark Brown Dog, you're going to find out who the main character is, what the inciting incident is, what is the rising action, what is the climax, what is the falling action, and what is the conclusion. So you're going to have that available to you to read. And then you also are going to have a story that's going to be included called To Build a Fire. So both of these stories, you're going to be doing the same thing here, finding out the main character, inciting incident, rising action, climax, falling action, conclusion. If you need to look back at these notes to find out the details of each of these, please do that, and then we will go over that together. So you will all send me who you think the main character is and all of these different steps of the short story for both Dark Brown Dog and To Build a Fire by Jack London. Okay? Have a great day. Bye.